Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything, countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Richard Leider, one of the world's most respected voices on purpose, aging, and adult development. At 80, he's still writing, coaching, keynoting, and as you'll hear, still deeply curious. Richard's books, including The Power of Purpose and Repacking Your Bags, have sold millions. But it's his lived wisdom, gleaned from time with thinkers like Viktor Frankl and Abraham Maslow, and decades of coaching leaders and elders that make this conversation resonate. We explore the timelessness and timeliness of purpose, why it matters not just in our 20s, but especially in our 60s, 70s, and beyond. Why growing and giving for life is a mantra worth waking up to, and how repacking, literally and metaphorically, is the work of every new quarter. This is part one of a two-part series. Today we'll explore the big picture, the science, stories, and soul of purpose. In part two, we'll get a bit more practical, diving into the daily practices that can bring purpose alive in later life. So grab a Post-it, write down grow and give, and listen in. Welcome, Richard Leider, to Four Quarter Lives. Lovely to have you with me.
A pleasure, an honor. Thank you.
The honor's entirely mutual. So, Richard, you are a pioneer. You've written over a dozen books on purpose, leadership, aging, choices. Let's start at the beginning, if we may. What led you to what has become a lifelong focus on purpose?
Well, I can't give it an actual start date, but I'm a listener. I listen for a living, like you do too, I think. And I learned early on that listening gives more help to people often than advice. And so very early on, I was a listener. And when I listened to, well, why do you do that if you're so unhappy? Why do you stay there? Why do you do? And so I looked at the why question very early in life and then started to fill it in later. So I'm doing what I love. And when I'm listening, I'm in flow. When I'm writing, I'm in flow, meaning that I shouldn't be doing anything else at that time. It's just natural.
You got into this really in what I would call almost your Q1 or just the beginning of Q2 in your 20s. You mentioned a formative encounter with Viktor Frankl back in the late 1960s. What did he say and what did he awaken in you, and how has that shaped the rest of the road?
Well, with a counseling psychology degrees, plural, and background, I had studied him. But all of a sudden, I found that he was doing a program in San Diego, and I was in Denver at the time, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the States. And I went there, and I got in, and I found that it was transformative. We've all had, I believe, people on this call, including you, fortuitous encounters with people who somehow the question they ask or the way they've showed up changed your life in certain ways. He changed mine. And he talked about, the last of the human freedoms is choice. And what choice do you have in a concentration camp? Well, you can get up and give somebody else hope, give somebody else a kind word, a hug, etc. And I thought, wow, how do we get this information out to people that don't go to therapy or don't go to psychology or just the norm? And so I started down that path. And he said, don't ask what's your purpose in life. Ask, what can you contribute? And he said, say yes to life in spite of everything. And he talked about tragic optimism. So there's a whole lot of things I could go into forever talking about how he transformed my own point of view. But those are a few.
Very relevant 40 years on in the chaos we're living.
For sure.
It's always good to quote and remember and reread Viktor Frankl right now. You were one of the very early voices in the field of adult development. So you led a fellowship with Harvard's adult development study. Again, pretty much of a fluke. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, I had a lot of flukes. And one of the other flukes, I would say, or one of the other wake-up calls was with Abraham Maslow. And Maslow and
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
He's quoted by everybody wrongly today. because the year before he died, he and Frankl actually came back together and agreed that the top of the pyramid, the Maslow pyramid, was not self-actualization, it was transcendence, which is purpose. It's serving others. And so I met with Maslow, and I don't have to go into the details, but just the year before he died, and the two of them came, and I went, geez, I mean, how do we get this information out there? So along the way, I can share how I got to today, but the fact is that Maslow and fortuitous encounters are important in our lives. And I have had a number of them, and I could go through others that were, people say, oh, you're so lucky. I mean, you met Frankl, you met Maslow, et cetera. It's true, I did.
It is kind of an extraordinary meeting of minds that you met these two sort of foundational, very much at the end of their lives, when you were still a very young man in your 20s. There was this kind of lovely intergenerational passing on of the flame, isn't there?
I think so. I also met Richard Bowles, who wrote the best-selling book, What Color is Your Parachute? And we taught together, we worked together, we did things together before he died. And so I really looked at it. My career has been a deep dive into the distinction between jobs, careers, and callings. I've been about helping people to discern their calling.
So you wrote a best-selling book, The Power of Purpose, which is now, I think, in its 4th edition, 40 years after.
Yeah, can you believe it?
That's a good record. What, if anything, has changed most in how people approach this idea of calling or purpose? And what hasn't changed? What have you seen over the last 4 decades?
Well, what hasn't changed is that purpose is always about serving others. It's always about, the spoiler alert that I get a groan for is that purpose is about service. And service does not mean being a servant or having, doing everything in your life to serve others. But you live in community, you live in relationships, and serving. As E.B. White, an American essayist, wrote, he said, I arise in the morning, torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. Well, I think there's a good balance there between saving and savoring and et cetera. So I do believe that ultimately what hasn't changed is that is about who you bring to life and to the world. What has changed, though, is it doesn't have to be noble. It doesn't have to be a big cause. It doesn't have to be a legacy. It can just be today's small. I make the distinction between the big P purpose, the noble purpose, and the little p purpose, which is the small. And small doesn't mean less impact. But today, when I got up, I asked myself, how am I going to make a contribution? And it can be a hug, a kind word, an email, something. And so when people start to look at it from a little p, they say, oh, I can do that. And the little p's end up being the big P ultimately.
So you've said that women sometimes come back at you on this stuff, saying, wait a minute, I've been in service for all of my Q2, and now my Q3 is going to be about self-actualization. What do you answer?
Go for it. But ultimately, at some point, you're going to say, I still feel the need to give. And so I don't need to be the giver or the caretaker per se. But, isolation is fatal. Going it alone, not a good idea. And so I recently had an Uber driver, and he picked me up and he said, where are you going? And I told him, and I was giving this talk at this Purposeful Aging Institute in Denver. And he said, what are you going to talk about? And I told him what I was going to talk about. And he turned the mirror and he said, Richard, you know how old I am? I said, no, not a clue. He said, I'm 81. I said, you're 81 and you're my Uber driver. Why are you driving? He said, because I retired and I was sitting at home watching TV about 47 hours a week. And then my wife died, who I was caregiving or taking care of. And I was lonely and I was feeling isolated. So I felt that, maybe I could be an Uber driver. And here I am meeting people like you and having this conversation. And so the point is here that isolation at any age or stage, how do you fill that void? You do it by somehow giving or connecting or feeling like you've got a reason to get up in the morning.
How do you look at this through a cross-cultural lens? You've been around the world, and
Yeah.
some cultures are so much more naturally collectivist, and you're preaching in the most individualistic culture on the planet, where
Right.
serving is kind of the name of the game. How do you compare the reception, perhaps, of your message or the hunger for it in these different countries?
Well, the hunger is universal. I think it's in our DNA to want to matter, to have our lives matter one way or another. I've been leading walking safaris in Tanzania since 1983. I sat around the fire with men and women elders looking at what I can learn from them about the fourth, thing that we're talking about, fourth quarter. One of the things that they said to me is that, we are a total sharing culture. And so one of the hunter-gatherers who was 80 some years old, and he's from a tribe called the Hadza, 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 hunter-gatherers, said to me, after listening to me questioning him around the fire, he said, Richard, you know what the two most important days in our life are as hunter-gatherers? And I said, yeah, birth and death. And he looked at me like, oh, you write all these books, you come out here and you're sitting and you've got the tent and I'm around the. I said, well, what are the two most important days? He said, birth, because of infant mortality. But the second most important day in our lives is discerning and as elders helping others discern why they're here, why they get, because the only way we've survived is through sharing. But sharing what? It's not just sharing food. It's not just sharing, it's sharing our talents, our wisdom, et cetera. And I can fill in the spaces in that. And I went, God, I've studied this all over the world. And here I'm sitting with people who are not literally educated, but wisdom educated, teaching me that this is really who we are as human beings. And the other thing I would say back to the female gender issue is that I co-created a foundation in Tanzania, in East Africa, and we spend our money on women becoming stewards of the future, going to secondary education center because we think women are the future. Why? I can't explain it, quite frankly. All I can explain is they are more steward focused than men. And we know that and we see that, and they go back after they've got their secondary education that we've helped them fund, and they go back to their villages and they do things that support not only their own families, but the village. And I think I don't know that I can explain it any clearer than that.
When you speak and talk, and certainly other guests I've had on the podcast working in anything resembling the longevity space say that women are far more attracted to the whole topic than men are. There's kind of a 70-30 ratio in interest in all these issues. Is that what you find too? Totally.
I find that when I do a program, whether it's in Costa Rica or Mexico or the US, 70%, I can't give it exact, but are women. And they are the ones, as I'm saying, that are the most curious about their own growth and the growth of their families and their communities. Men are, like me, I grew up more competitive, I want to succeed. So redefining success, I think, is way more relevant and visible with women in these audiences than men. And men come up afterwards kind of sheepishly and say, I've been successful, but I'm not fulfilled. What's that all about? And so oftentimes we can talk in depth about that, but I find that, I've coached a lot of CEOs, a lot of C-level people like you have, and I find that being successful redefines itself at different stages, in the fourth quarter certainly is one of those, or one of the big ones. We live in three hoods. We live in a childhood, adulthood, and elderhood, but there's really no great map except for people like you who are helping us create a map for the third hood.
Any evolution in this 40 years you've been watching this between these gender? I mean, do you think we still have young men who are chasing down the competitive career path and women more balanced? I mean, is this still true?
For me, it is my observation. I'm saying, I mean, I'm 80. I'm going to be 81 in a few weeks. And so I look at what I still love to work. I still love to write. When I'm writing, I'm in the flow state. I don't want to be any other place. When I'm on stage doing a talk, I'm in the flow state. I want to continue doing that. So it's not about my own relevance, but it's about helping people feel relevant and visible, men and women, as they get into the fourth quarter. And so when one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Bill Thomas, a gerontologist, says, don't ever use the word still. You're still writing, you're still doing this. Says, well, who gets to define still? Who gets to define what success is, whatever the quarter it happens to be?
You must be a little chuffed. I mean, you've written purpose is not a luxury, it's a fundamental. And the science has kind of caught up with you.
It has.
Between purpose and longevity and health. Share a little bit what you have most appreciated from what the scientists have delivered.
Well, I mean, we could go a long ways into this one, but in the past, purpose was kind of like kumbaya, spiritual and nice to have, but I got to pay a mortgage or raise kids or do this or do that. And what we found over time, what they have found, I just was the keynote speaker at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which is actually a bona fide U.S. part of the American Medical Association. I was the only one of 100 people in the room who was a practitioner. And I got a standing ovation because I talked about the practice of their research. But their research, these were people I was sitting next to and on panels with, were things like the telomeres effect. Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for Medicine based on her distinction or her observation about the telomere effect. Well, you have and I have telomeres. Every one of our DNA, we have like the shoelace at the end of a shoelace. We have something that if it grows or sustains, we live longer and we're healthier. If it shrinks, well, what causes it to grow? What causes it to sustain itself? Well, one of the key factors was purpose and having a reason to get up in the morning. And she was able to measure that. So even simple things like that, the telomere effect. And I say, and with great confidence today, that purpose is fundamental to health, to healing, to happiness, ultimately to longevity. And you can have, this is kind of a funny, simple one, but I live in a community here where 3M company, big international company, exists. It's a client of mine, actually. And so I gave a talk there about the 3Ms, money, medicine, and meaning. And they thought, oh, how cool this was that I've, suggested this for them. I said, no, we need all three. We need money, enough to survive. Well, how much is enough? That's a whole nother conversation. We need medicine, which means health, not just pharmaceuticals, but we also need meaning. We need an attitude and a reason to get up in the morning beyond ourselves. So we need all three: money, medicine, and meaning. And so the science now backs that up big time. And we could go into a lot of different studies that I sat on the stage with just a couple of weeks ago with these scientists and they said, how do we get the message out? And you're doing it. That's what you're doing right now.
It must be extraordinarily gratifying to sit there after decades of preaching this stuff.
It is. I couldn't believe it. These are people I'm sitting next to are in my book.
Yes.
And they said, thank you. And how do we get it out there, basically.
So you've recently graduated or entered what I call the fourth quarter. You're a few years in now. What surprised you most, if anything, about this transition from Q3 to Q4? Is there one? And you've written a bit about this particular potential crisis of relevance, visibility. Did you experience any of that or not at all? Or what do you observe for others?
Oh, there's a lot in that to unpack. It's a great question. I find, for example, that the subtitle of the fourth edition, and I'm not trying to sell books here, but the subtitle is Grow and Give for Life. And I found if you really narrow it all down, that's it. Growing and giving for life. Are you growing and are you giving for life? Not just for your own life, but for life generally.
I stole that from you years ago. I took that as my mantra for the third quarter is to grow and give. It's a wonderful pairing.
So I find myself continually asking myself, am I growing and giving for life? Without trying to be noble or trying to be anything other than who I am. The other thing is that Parker Palmer gave this to me. I don't know if you know Parker Palmer's work and his writings, et cetera. But so he said, and he endorsed my last book, which was, and there's a story about him in the book. The last book was Who Do You Want to Be When You Grow Old? The Path of Purposeful Aging. And he said this, which I live with on a day-to-day basis. He said it was from the St. Benedictine Catholic faith, but he said, when you look at life on a day-to-day basis, ask yourself the more kind of the mortality question. And the question is basically, keep death daily in your eyes, which I do. And you think, oh God, does that, Tim? It is inspiring. Keep death daily means, look, I don't know how many more days, weeks, months I have, but I know that time is my most precious commodity and it's my most precious currency. And so on a day-to-day basis, I look at mortality not as a fear. I know, or I have a feeling about it, but what I look at is, what am I doing today to be alive and to stay alive and to be happy?
So what does that look like daily? I'm just curious. You talk a lot about the practice of purpose. What does looking daily at mortality look like for an 80-year-old?
What it looks like is what I preach in my practices, and that is for myself. And that is, I did a PBS special in the States. It was shown in many, many communities. And one of the things that I still get feedback on was I said, take out a Post-it. Here's one right here. Take out a Post-it and write 2 words on it, grow and give. And then put that on your mirror. And tomorrow morning when you wake up, ask yourself, how am I going to grow and give today? And at the end of the day, before you go to sleep at night, ask yourself this question, how did I grow and give today? And so I do that. And I put this Post-it on my mirror. People said, you have it on your own mirror? And I said, yeah. Why? And I said, because it works. And I get it from a lot of other people who say, I put that grow and give on my mirror and I still have it there after a seminar or a talk or something like that. And so I think growing and giving for life is a practice. And the other practice that I do on a day-to-day basis is, and I just did it a while back here, and when I wake up in the morning, I take 3 steps. Step 1 is pause. Don't reach for your phone, your cell phone. Step 2 is take 3 deep breaths. Step 3 is ask yourself, why am I here? What am I about this day? If I died today, would it have been a good day or not a good day? And so, those are really simple, but when you start to engage with that intention on a day-to-day basis, life changes. So in my 80s, I'm going to turn 81, I feel gifted because I'm healthy. And I did not always have, I've never been in the hospital except a year ago since I was born. Wow. I mean, what kind of gift is that for life? And so I had a surgery that required me to be in the hospital for about 4 days, and it was a pretty serious surgery, et cetera. And at that point, I went, well, I may not make this. If I don't, what's the point? What would have been the point? So I think I shared with you when we talked that one of my colleagues, I don't have it here in front of me, but when you pick up when you call him on his cell phone, at the sound of the tone, he says, please leave your answer to life's 2 eternal questions. who are you and what do you want?
Wonderful.
And so I think the who are you and what do you want comes up every day when you're in your 80s. What do you think?
I think it's a great question that a lot of people would run a million miles from, particularly at
Yeah.
that age. And I'm curious. So you've never been in the hospital till last year. Suddenly you go through this experience, which a lot of people start in Q4 bumping up into the health dimension.
Yeah.
What did change? Anything? Did it make you think more deeply about these questions or in a different register?
Another great question. You ask the best questions. It's made me more sensitive to, I would say, and I don't want to put myself in any exalted version of this, but compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, people who have compassion, because I hadn't been in that situation before, and all of a sudden, I am looking at other people who have got issues, maybe worse than mine, maybe the same, and how can I be more compassionate? How can I be more sensitive to their fears and their needs, et cetera? And so I cry more now. I cry more, not for a lot of reasons, but I cry because I need to be more compassionate. I want to be more compassionate. I need to learn how to be more compassionate to people who have, and they may be in the fourth quarter, but they may be in the first quarter along the way. So I think what I've learned from, and to your question, is how to feel more.
It's a beautiful part of Q4 is resonance. Is that part of the transcendence that you speak about? Beyond self-actualization? Is it just an emotional opening up to others and others' pain?
I think that's one piece of it. The other piece is curiosity. I find oftentimes that the people I'm most resonant with or attracted to are the curious ones. And I find there's quite a few people who kind of have lived their lives. They're in the fourth quarter. It's not like they know it all. It's not that kind of a thing, but they lack curiosity. And what I'm not struggling with, but to answer your question is that I was backstage not too long ago with Richard Saul-Wurman, who was the founder of TED, the TED Talks.
TED Talks, yep.
So we're backstage and he says, well, Richard, you're in your 80s, I'm in my 80s. He's older than me. What are you going to talk about? And I said, purpose. And I said, well, Richard, what are you going to talk about? And he said, curiosity. TED was created based on my and others' curiosity about not only technology, entertainment, and design, but life. And I said, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many times my wife, Sally, and I go out to dinner or go out to something with people, and we find people that all they talk about is they're not curious. Let's put it that way. I don't want to be strident about it, but they're not curious. And we said they didn't ask us a thing about ourselves the whole night. They talked about their trips and their grandkids and their organ recital, et cetera. And that's all important. But is that it? And so I think one of the key ingredients, as Richard Saul-Wurman said, is if you're not curious in the fourth quarter, or any quarter, but the fourth quarter in particular that we're talking about here, about yourself, about life, about others, it's not going to be a purposeful, satisfying experience. So curiosity is not just about opening a book or reading or going on the internet. It has to do with your basic take on life. What is it that you think, what's the point? What are we doing here? Why are you here? All of that. I want to know, not an answer, but I want to have a conversation.
And again, I can only return a little bit to my experience cross-culturally of finding the most individualistic cultures, of which the U.S. is always a leader. And
for sure. Yeah.
We've often left dinner parties saying we were not asked a single question. and
how did that make you feel?
Well, astonished by that lack of curiosity, which is, I think, a little bit more natural in more collectivist cultures. Now, would you agree with that? Or where is this curiosity gene? How does it get shut down? And how do we encourage people who may be in cultures that are more self-oriented, to open up in these later decades of life to the
Yeah.
all of what you're talking, all these C words. I mean, I'm noting a bunch of the compassion, curiosity, care.
Yeah.
How do you open that up?
I don't know.
Can you?
I know part of it is just listening and getting your ego out of the way. So I don't really care if they know where I was just hiking in the Alps. I don't really care if they are curious about certain things, but what are they curious about? What am I curious about? And so I think the future belongs to the learners, not the knowers. And in the fourth quarter, the learners are oftentimes parked, not learning. And it doesn't mean going to school or doing things, but it means living in the questions, like the mystery of, who are you and what do you want, like the phone, like the phone conversation. And my Uber driver, who was saying, I love driving because I get to listen to people like you, I get to meet people like you who I'll never meet again, but it makes my day in certain ways. So there's a certain aliveness that comes with being curious and being a learner. So I kind of deviate on that a bit, I guess. But and I think that the late, not late, but Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General of the U.S. and now isn't, unfortunately, but when he, in his letter of resignation, talked about the triad of fulfillment. And the triad of fulfillment backs up in his science, back to your question about science, backs up exactly what we're talking about here. He said the triad of fulfillment is meaning, purpose, and service. And the bottom line of that is being curious about meaning, about service, and about purpose in certain ways. And so are serving in certain ways. So, we can unpack all of these to say, well, what's the ultimate answer? Well, I think it's common sense. I think we know what we're here to do. And one of the things I wanted to share with you, because I'm not sure I did before, was way back when we started this conversation, back after getting out of graduate school and meeting Frankl and Maslow, et cetera, I was an early executive in U.S. Bank and General Mills, two big companies in the U.S. And it used to be called personnel. Now it's called human resources.
Yep.
And one of the things I did, though, which I am so proud of, and so when I look back, is what I called a side hustle. I had something called Lunch Hour Limited. If you bought me lunch, I would coach you. So I'm an HR executive. The CEOs didn't think this was a cool idea, actually, as one of their top HR folks, personnel folks at the time. But what I found was so many people were hungering for more than a job, more than a career, wanting a calling, something that fit who they were and they could bring to work every day. And that really grabbed me. And Frankl talked a lot about that. He talked about success with significance. So that became my calling. And I actually left the HR field, took a mortgage on my house, and opened a company called the Inventure Group and started writing in my first book, The Inventurers, et cetera. And so, I followed my own calling. So I feel good, not to brag about it, but people say, oh, you're so lucky you hit it just right with the boomers. I said, maybe. But the fact is, I took a risk. And so the whole courage and curiosity thing, the additional C here, courage, is to try something.
Choose. Now, there's another C that doesn't sound like it, but we'll take it anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll end then just with one of the concepts. You've written so much. I'm not going to summarize your dozen books here, but perhaps for listeners who aren't quite there yet or who have not yet found their purpose. I love your whole concept about the unpacking and repacking of bags. Share that with, where did that come from? And
what that came from was in Africa in the early stages. When I went to Africa, I was on the board of Outward Bound, the outdoor organization, to climb Kilimanjaro, to raise money. And I fell in love with Africa and the people of Africa mostly. And I decided I would start leading my own trips. So I was leading backpacking trips. And on one of those early trips, picture yourself with a backpack on, and you're in the green hills of Africa between the Serengeti and the mountains like Kilimanjaro and others. And the elder guide who is leading us on this, helping me, is a guy named Koye. And he said, he looks over his shoulder and he says, Richard, you're slumping. You see, you're not noticing all the beauty around you. And I said, so when we got to where we were going to be that evening, I put my pack down and he said, Richard, what are all you carrying in these backpacks? Because this is new to him. So I opened up my backpack, I put on the ground a little tarp, and all the little kids in the village, his village that we were staying at, came, and I started to take one thing out after another. Out comes the wilderness medicine kit, out comes the water filters and other things. And at the end of which he looks at this pile on the ground. I can picture it to this minute. And he said, Richard, tell me, does all this make you happy?
Oh, God.
And I said, well, I don't need it to be happy, but I need this for this. And I realized that I was carrying a load more than I needed. And, it's good to prepare, et cetera. And so that became the conversation of the du jour when I went back to the fire that night, and you're sitting around the fire, metaphorically. And I said, I'm going to leave half of my stuff here. I'm not going to take it with me because this is not making me happy. Then we started to talk about our lives. Well, what is the good life? What does make us happy? And so in my journal that night in my tent, I wrote, Richard, repack your bags, lighten your load for life. And I came back and I co-authored a best-selling book. It sold over 1 million copies called Repacking Your Bags. And it has because my co-author, just to end this, my co-author is a philosophy professor, tenured philosophy professor. So we looked at the good life over time from Plato and Aristotle and others. And we said, well, what makes the good life? And we did a good life inventory, which is in the book. And I would love to share it with your listeners.
That will be in part 2 of this.
Yeah.
Today, I think we're maybe going to just end on what's your one piece of advice to somebody in Q3 about when do you know it's time to repack?
Oh, wow. Well, I would say that purpose is a verb, not a noun. It's an action. What is your action today? What is your one thing you can do today to make a difference in one other person's life? My purpose is, big P, is to help others unlock the power of purpose. I write about it, speak about it, and do. My little p purpose, including this morning today, is to make a difference in one person's life. So I hope I've made a difference today in one person's life on your show, because I hope you invite me back, because you are a magnificent, masterful interviewer and listener, and I want to do more with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We're going to do a part 2 on the practices of purpose and how to put some of this stuff into action. But for today, listen up, guys. Pack your bags, repack. Think about all the things that you're carrying that may not be serving you or helping you serve anybody else. Richard, you've certainly changed my life today. Thank you for being with me.
Distinct pleasure. Thank you.
Until next time. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.